Usually when we look back at a major historical figure, we expect to find a really solid, reliable foundation.
Yeah.
Like inspecting a monument or something.
Yeah, yeah.
You walk up to it, you read the bronze plaque, you admire the marble columns, and history just sort of points at it and says, there it is.
Yeah.
That's who they were.
Yeah.
That is the definitive story.
Yeah, the nice, neat package.
Exactly. And it's comforting. I mean, we want the heroes to be heroes and the villains to be villains.
Yeah.
Because it just makes the past easy to digest.
Absolutely.
But then you step into the world of America's founding, and specifically into the mind of our third president, and suddenly that solid marble foundation starts to look, well, incredibly fragile.
It really does. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
You cannot just read the plaque and walk away. Because the deeper you look, the more the traditional narrative just sort of fractures into something vastly more complicated.
So we are bypassing the plaque entirely today. We are pulling together a massive stack of historical documentation to really trace the life, the presidency, and the incredibly complex legacy of Thomas Jefferson.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. On the table today, for you listening at home, we have encyclopedic timelines of his early life and his administrations. We've got incredibly dense academic papers digging into the geopolitical weeds of the Barbary Pirates.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Oh, totally. And the true constitutional crisis behind the Louisiana Purchase. We're also looking at comprehensive deep dives into the Sally Hemings DNA controversy.
Right, pulling from that landmark 1998 study in Nature magazine.
Yep, Nature magazine, and the subsequent roundtable discussions from PBS Frontline. Plus, we have detailed historical analyses of the first American party system.
Those vicious political battles that essentially birthed the partisan divides we still recognize today.
Yeah, it is a remarkable collection of documents.
Yeah.
And what is our real mission here today?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the sources force us to look at the entire scope of the man. We are not just doing a highlights reel,
Yeah.
We are looking at how a singular mind shaped the United States into what it is today through sheer brilliance, staggering luck, and frankly, profound hypocrisy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are not just going to read you a timeline today. We are here to dissect the mind of a man who quite literally wrote the blueprint for American liberty while simultaneously and actively contradicting that very liberty in his daily life.
The contradictions are just glaring.
They really are. And the core contradiction we're going to keep bumping into is how a guy who built his entire political identity on the absolute necessity of limiting federal power ends up radically expanding the power of the presidency in ways his predecessors never even dreamed of.
Yeah, to understand how he gets there, how the architect of limited government becomes the president who doubles the size of the nation with the stroke of a pen, we really have to start at the beginning. We have to start in the colony of Virginia, on the western edge of the frontier.
Right, so we're talking April 13, 1743, at the Shadwell Plantation.
Yeah.
And his background is, I think, the skeleton key to understanding his psychology.
Oh, definitely.
He's born into this very specific strata of society, like the planter elite. His mother, Jane Randolph, comes from one of the most prominent aristocratic families in Virginia.
Which gives him the pedigree.
Exactly. But his father, Peter Jefferson, is a slightly different story, and I think a much more influential one.
Absolutely. Because Peter Jefferson was a successful farmer and a self-made man of the frontier, but more importantly for our understanding of Thomas, Peter was a highly skilled surveyor.
And a cartographer. Right.
Yes. In fact, Peter helped produce the Joshua Fry Peter Jefferson map, which was the first truly accurate map of the province of Virginia.
Wow.
Now, think about what a surveyor actually does in the 18th century. You are taking a chaotic, overgrown, wild frontier, and you are literally dragging iron chains through the mud to impose a strict mathematical geometric grid upon it. You are forcing order onto chaos.
I really love that connection. He inherits that categorizing, measuring perspective right from his father. It's a whole mental framework.
Exactly.
He doesn't just want to map out the physical geography. He wants to map out human society. Like, he wants to impose a rational grid on philosophy, on government, on literally everything.
And that meticulous categorizing mindset is heavily reinforced by his education. So he attends the College of William and Mary, but the real turning point is when he begins studying law under George Wythe in Williamsburg.
George Wythe being a massive deal back then.
Huge deal. Wythe was one of the greatest legal minds in the colonies, but studying law back then wasn't, a standardized 3-year program where you sit in a lecture hall, you apprentice.
Right. And Wise doesn't just hand him a few law books and say good luck. He puts Jefferson through an extraordinarily rigorous 5-year course of study.
5 years. I mean, that was more than double the typical duration for an aspiring lawyer at the time. Most guys read the law for a year or two and took the bar.
Well,
Wythe had Jefferson reading English common law, yes, but also the classics in Greek and Latin, history, mathematics, and natural philosophy.
so he's getting this incredibly broad education.
Yeah. By the time Jefferson is admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767, he is widely considered one of the most learned, well-read lawyers in all of America. He just has this massive intellectual toolkit.
He's fundamentally an Enlightenment-era mind.
Completely. He deeply believes that human reason, if applied systematically, can solve any problem.
And you can see the physical manifestation of that Enlightenment mind almost immediately. Like in 1769, on land he inherited from his father, he starts designing and building his home, Monticello.
Right.
And building almost feels like the wrong word. It was a lifelong obsession.
It was a continuous, never-ending project. I mean, he was always tearing down walls, redesigning the dome, adding new porticos.
I want you to imagine this house for those listening, because to me, Monticello is the perfect analogy for Jefferson himself. It's like a physical manifestation of his brain.
That's a great way to put it.
First of all, it is perched on this literal pedestal, a levels-off mountaintop above the surrounding landscape. And inside, it is just packed with his clever inventions and intellectual obsessions.
Like the swivel chair.
Yes,
Yeah.
the swivel chair, which he essentially invented so he could read multiple books at once.
Right.
And he's got a polygraph machine, which isn't a lie detector, to be clear, but this incredible wooden device with multiple pens that automatically copies his letters as he writes them.
Because he wrote thousands of letters.
Thousands. And he's got fossils of giant prehistoric sloths, the megalonyx, displayed right in his entrance hall alongside Native American artifacts. It's this temple to reason.
It really is the ultimate Enlightenment laboratory. He even designed a clock for the entrance hall that was powered by cannonballs dropping down the wall.
Wait, really? Cannonball?
Yeah, cannonballs.
What?
And it told him the day of the week as well as the time, just based on where the cannonballs were on the wall.
That's wild.
Yeah.
But, and this is the massive, unavoidable but that we have to confront right now, this entire beautiful, rational architecture is built entirely on an unseen, brutal foundation.
Yes.
The whole thing only functions, his entire life of the mind is only possible because of the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved human beings.
Exactly.
And what's chilling to me is how he designed the house to accommodate that reality. He built hidden dumbwaiters into the sides of the fireplaces. He constructed subterranean passageways beneath the house.
Right.
Why? So that the enslaved workers moving food, wine, and supplies remained largely invisible to his guests. A bottle of imported French wine would just magically appear in the dining room.
It's a profound architectural metaphor. He designs this highly engineered system where the ugly, brutal reality that sustains his idyllic life is literally hidden underground.
Yeah.
It allows him to maintain the illusion of this perfect, rational, elevated existence on the mountaintop.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see that exact same compartmentalization in his political philosophy later on. Right. It really makes you wonder about the psychological isolation of that setup. Like when you place yourself on a literal mountaintop above the rest of the world, designing a perfect utopian space where your every need is met invisibly. How does that affect how you view the messy reality of the people down below?
Well, it absolutely fosters a certain aloofness, an idealism that can easily become detached from practical reality, because he genuinely believed in the inherent goodness of the yeoman farmer.
The independent guy with his own land.
Right, the independent, self-sufficient citizen working his own small plot of land. That, to Jefferson, was the purest form of Republican virtue. That was the ideal citizen for a democracy.
But he's observing this ideal from a mountaintop, surrounded by thousands of books, fine wine, and enslaved servants.
Exactly. He isn't observing it from the mud of the actual fields.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the moment his pen literally changes the world.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward to 1776. The Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. The colonies have been in a shooting war with Great Britain for over a year.
Yeah, things are escalating.
And they finally decide they need a formal document to explain to the world exactly why they're breaking away.
So they form a committee of 5 to draft this declaration. And it includes heavyweights like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, but the actual physical writing of the first draft falls to the 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson.
There's a fantastic historical exchange between Jefferson and John Adams regarding this exact moment. Adams basically refuses to write it and insists Jefferson do it.
Right. Years later, Adams actually recounted the conversation. Jefferson asks Adams why he won't draft it, and Adams gives him three distinct reasons.
Okay, what were they?
First, because Jefferson is a Virginian, and Adams knew that Virginia, being the largest and wealthiest colony, needed to be at the absolute head of the independence movement to ensure the southern colonies stayed in the fight.
Makes total strategic sense.
Second, Adams says, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise.
Which is just a brilliant, incredibly self-aware moment for John Adams. He basically admits, like, look, if I write this, people will vote against it just because they find me annoying.
He knew his brand. And the third reason Adams gives is the most important. He tells Jefferson, you can write 10 times better than I can.
And he wasn't wrong at all. So Jefferson retreats to his rented rooms in Philadelphia and drafts the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. He takes the dense, complex political philosophy of the Enlightenment, specifically the ideas of John Locke regarding natural rights and the social contract.
Yeah.
And he distills it into this soaring, poetic, world-shaking prose.
He creates a moral standard that the world is still trying to live up to. And yet the historical record notes that when the Continental Congress begins debating his draft, making cuts and edits over several days, Jefferson does not take it well.
Oh, he hated it, right?
He absolutely hated it. Benjamin Franklin actually had to sit next to him and try to calm him down because Jefferson was, in Franklin's words, writhing a little under the acrimonious criticism.
Oh.
He hated having his perfect words altered by a committee.
Again, the architect who hates when someone else scribbles on his blueprint. So he drafts this incredible document. He goes on to serve as the governor of Virginia during the Revolution, which, by the way, was a highly stressful term that actually ends with him having to flee Monticello on horseback just minutes ahead of British cavalry.
Barely escaped.
Right. And then, after the war, he goes to Paris to serve as the American diplomat to France.
Which is huge because he replaces Benjamin Franklin in Paris, which is no small feat. And he immerses himself in French culture, architecture, and the early rumblings of the French Revolution.
He's just soaking it all in.
He loves the intellectual vibrancy of Europe, but he also develops a deep disgust for the extreme wealth inequality and the corrupt monarchies he sees over there.
But eventually, to protect that idyllic agrarian American society he envisions from his mountaintop, he has to leave Paris. He has to cross the Atlantic and descend back into the mud of national politics.
Right.
Because while he was gone, the United States scrapped its first government and wrote the Constitution. George Washington is the newly elected first president, and he asked Jefferson to come to New York to be the first Secretary of State.
And Jefferson accepts, but he walks right into a powder keg.
Tell me about it.
Washington's cabinet was designed to be a team of rivals, bringing different geographic and ideological perspectives together. But it quickly devolved into an existential battle for the soul of the country.
Because you have Jefferson as Secretary of State, and you have Alexander Hamilton, this brilliant, relentless New Yorker, as the Secretary of the Treasury.
Yes.
And these two men have completely fundamentally opposite visions for what America should be. I really want to dig into this because this rivalry is the genesis of the first American party system. It sets the stage for everything Jefferson does as president.
Let's break down the divide. So Jefferson, working closely with James Madison, forms what becomes known as the Democratic-Republican Party.
Okay, let's just call them the Republicans for short today. Though it is crucial to note for you listening that they are the ancestors of the modern Democratic Party, just to keep things incredibly confusing for anyone studying history.
Exactly. History loves to do that. So Jefferson's Republicans believe deeply in states' rights. They are terrified of a consolidated national government that could easily turn into a monarchy.
Right.
Therefore, they want a strict, literal interpretation of the Constitution. Their argument is very simple. If the Constitution does not explicitly, word for word, say the federal government has the power to do something, then the federal government cannot do it.
They want the power kept as close to the people as possible.
Right. They champion the agrarian yeoman farmer. They fear large, crowded cities, which Jefferson views as breeding grounds for corruption and mobs. They fear a standing army in peacetime, seeing it as a tool for tyranny, and they absolutely despise centralized banking. Furthermore, they look at the French Revolution, despite its escalating bloodshed, as a positive, necessary continuation of the global fight for liberty that America started.
Wow, okay. And then sitting across the cabinet table is Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists.
Oh.
And they're looking at the exact same country and seeing a totally different path to survival.
Totally different. Hamilton believes that the United States is weak, broke, and surrounded by hostile European empires. He believes that for the nation to survive, it needs a strong, powerful central government.
The opposite of Jefferson.
Exactly. He wants to assume all the individual state debts from the Revolution and roll them into one massive national debt to build credit. He wants a national bank to control the currency. He wants to actively promote commerce, manufacturing, and industry. He doesn't want a nation of farmers. He wants a nation of factories and trade.
And culturally, the Federalists look to Great Britain, our former enemy, as the ultimate model for economic stability, naval power, and orderly government. They look at the French Revolution and see anarchy, atheism, and the guillotine.
Right. Hamilton essentially believes that liberty cannot exist without strong authority and a robust financial system. But Jefferson looks at Hamilton's plans, especially the national bank and the national debt, and he sees the creeping return of monarchy and British-style corruption.
He genuinely believes Hamilton is actively trying to destroy the republic from within.
Yes, replacing it with an aristocracy of bankers and speculators.
And they hated each other.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't just a polite disagreement over tax policy in a committee room. They were secretly funding rival newspapers to endlessly smear each other in the press.
It was incredibly toxic. They genuinely believed the other was an existential threat to the survival of the United States, and this toxic rivalry eventually exhausts Jefferson.
So he quits.
He resigns from Washington's cabinet in 1793. He goes back to Monticello, claiming he is done with politics forever. He's just going to grow his peas and read his books.
But of course he isn't done. The political polarization only deepens during the 1790s. When George Washington steps down, Jefferson is pulled back into the fray. He runs for president in 1796 against his old friend John Adams, who is now the standard-bearer for the Federalist Party.
And under the rules of the Electoral College at the time, electors didn't cast separate votes for president and vice president.
Right.
They just cast 2 votes. Whoever got the most votes became president, and whoever came in second became vice president.
Which is a wild system.
It's remarkably dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Adams narrowly wins, so Jefferson becomes the vice president to his political rival.
You essentially have the leader of the opposition serving as the deputy to the president.
Mm-hmm.
And Jefferson spends 4 years as vice president, quietly undermining Adams's administration and organizing the Republican Party for the next election.
Which sets up the absolute showdown of the election of 1800.
This is the rematch. President John Adams versus Vice President Thomas Jefferson. I want to spend some time here because people today complain about negative political campaigning. The election of 1800 makes modern elections look like a polite tea party.
It was incredibly polarized and vicious. The Federalist newspapers launched an all-out assault on Jefferson's character. They charged that he was a godless libertine and an atheist.
Wow.
They told voters that if Jefferson won, the radical, bloody elements of the French Revolution would be imported to America. One famous Federalist editorial literally warned that if Jefferson was elected, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced.
That is insane. They were telling people to hide their Bibles because Jefferson would send troops to confiscate them.
Yeah, that was a real rumor. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans were just as ruthless. They accused Adams of being a secret monarchist, plotting to subvert liberty, establish a family dynasty, and marry his son into the British royal family.
Just making things up.
Pretty much. And they accused the Federalists of using their recently passed Alien and Sedition Acts to illegally crush free speech and jail political opponents.
Which, to be fair, the Federalists were actually doing.
That part was true, yes.
But the truly crazy part of the 1800 election isn't the rhetoric. It's the mechanical failure of the Electoral College.
Oh, this is a mess.
Jefferson runs with Aaron Burr of New York as his intended vice president.
Yeah.
The Republican strategy is for all their electors to vote for Jefferson and Burr, but one elector is supposed to withhold their vote for Burr, ensuring Jefferson finishes first and Burr finishes second.
A simple plan, but the plan fails. Someone forgets to withhold the vote. So Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tie for first place with 73 electoral votes each. Adams comes in third with 65.
So what happens?
Because of the tie, the Constitution dictates that the election goes to the House of Representatives to break it.
But here's the agonizing twist. The newly elected Congress doesn't take office until March. So the outgoing House of Representatives, which is still controlled by the lame duck Federalists, has to decide the winner.
Imagine you are a Federalist congressman in early 1801. You have to choose between Thomas Jefferson, the man you have spent a decade despising and fearing as a radical atheist, Or Aaron Burr, a man from your own state of New York who is widely considered an ambitious, unpredictable opportunist with no fixed political principles.
What a choice. So they vote in the House, and it ties. They vote again, tied. They vote 35 times over several days, and it is deadlocked every single time.
It is a profound constitutional crisis. The nation is completely paralyzed. There are credible rumors that the governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania are preparing to mobilize their state militias and march on Washington, D.C. if the Federalists try to steal the election.
The young nation is literally teetering on the edge of a civil war.
It was that close.
And then, the most unlikely person steps in to resolve it. Alexander Hamilton.
Yes, Hamilton intervenes. Hamilton has spent his entire career fighting Jefferson's politics, but he makes a calculated assessment. He writes a series of frantic letters to his Federalist allies in Congress.
Same one.
He argues that while Jefferson has wrong-headed policies, he at least has core principles and a stake in the survival of the nation. He views Aaron Burr, on the other hand, as an embryo Caesar, a man with no principles whatsoever who would sell out the country for his own advancement.
Hamilton literally writes that Jefferson is by far not so dangerous a man as Burr. He puts his country over his party hatred.
He does. Hamilton uses his immense influence to persuade a few Federalist congressmen from Maryland and Vermont to submit blank ballots on the 36th vote. By abstaining, they lower the threshold needed for a majority, and Thomas Jefferson finally wins the presidency.
And this leads us to what Jefferson later called the Revolution of 1800. And we really need to clarify what he meant by that, because it wasn't a revolution with muskets.
Right. He meant it was a revolution of principle. It was the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political factions in modern history. Think about the global precedent at the time.
It's unheard of.
The Federalists held the presidency, they controlled Congress, they had the army, they had the navy, and they lost an election. And instead of using the military to keep power, instead of starting a war, John Adams packed his bags, got in a carriage, and went home to Massachusetts.
We take that entirely for granted today, but back then, kings didn't just hand over the crown because farmers cast paper ballots. It proved the American constitutional experiment could actually survive a stress test.
Exactly.
So Jefferson is inaugurated on March 4th, 1801. He's the first president to take the oath in the new, muddy, swampy, half-built capital of Washington, D.C., and his actions on that day are very deliberate. Right?
Completely deliberate. Washington and Adams had maintained a certain level of European formality. They wore swords, they rode in ornate carriages, they held formal levees. Jefferson strips all of that away.
He dresses plainly.
He does. He doesn't take a fancy carriage. He just walks from his boarding house down the muddy street to the Capitol to take the oath. He is visually demonstrating that the government is returning to the people.
And in his inaugural address, he delivers a famous line trying to cool the temperature in the room. He says, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists."
It's a beautiful sentiment, attempting to heal the massive wounds of the 1800 election.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back on that. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Was he actually trying to heal the country? Or was this a deeply pragmatic power play? Like, was he just trying to peel off the moderate Federalists, absorb them into his own movement, and basically declare the hardcore Federalist leadership dead?
That is a very sharp read of the situation, because if you look at his subsequent actions, it heavily supports the latter theory. He wanted to dismantle the Hamiltonian Federalist program entirely, but he wanted to do it by making them politically irrelevant, not by going to war with them.
Right.
The historical record shows his administration immediately went to work systematically rolling back the 1790s.
Let's look at exactly how he did that mechanically. The Federalists had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to punish political opposition and jail Republican newspaper editors. Jefferson immediately pardons everyone prosecuted under those acts.
He clears them?
Yep. Then, he and his incredibly brilliant Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, go on a massive cost-cutting spree.
They want a frugal government that leaves people alone. So Gallatin and Jefferson look at the budget. They slash the size of the standing army down to just over 3,300 men, mostly just garrisoning frontier forts.
Wow.
They take an axe to the Navy. The Federalists had built these beautiful, expensive, heavily armed frigates. Jefferson halts naval construction and replaces the frigates with cheap, small coastal gunboats that are purely defensive.
Because if you don't have a blue water navy, you can't get dragged into European wars.
Exactly. They eliminate the hated internal taxes, particularly the whiskey excise tax that had caused a rebellion during Washington's term. They close unnecessary diplomatic offices. And incredibly, despite removing the internal taxes, they take the national debt, which was roughly $83 million, and over his presidency, they drop it down to $57 million.
How do they pay off debt without taxes? Like, how does that math work?
By relying almost entirely on import duties, tariffs on foreign goods brought into American ports, and the sale of Western lands, it is a radical shrinking of the federal footprint. He is actively trying to implement that mountaintop vision, a limited, unobtrusive government that handles foreign mail and stays out of the way.
But this brings us to a crucial turning point. Maintaining that idyllic agrarian vision of millions of independent farmers requires one specific resource. It requires land.
You need lots of land.
You can't have a nation of Yoan farmers if they're all crowded onto the eastern seaboard. And that leads us to the most significant and arguably the most constitutionally hypocritical decision of his entire life, the Louisiana Purchase.
Let's set the geopolitical stage, because the Louisiana Purchase is actually a story about European wars and Caribbean slave revolts.
Okay, lay it out.
The Louisiana Territory was a massive, vaguely defined swath of land stretching from the Mississippi River west to the Rocky Mountains. Spain had held it, but in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte secretly forced Spain to return it to France.
Because Napoleon is conquering Europe, and he has a grand vision for North America.
Yes. Napoleon wants to reestablish a French empire in the Americas. His plan is to use the vast agricultural potential of the Louisiana Territory, specifically the Mississippi River Valley, to feed and supply the crown jewel of the French colonial empire,
Which was?
the sugar-producing island of Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti.
But Napoleon hits a massive wall there. Specifically, he hits the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, led by Toussaint Louverture, rebel. They fight for their freedom, and they wage a brilliant, brutal guerrilla war. Napoleon sends tens of thousands of crack French troops to crush the rebellion, and they are absolutely decimated by the formerly enslaved fighters and by yellow fever.
It is a total disaster for France. Without the sugar wealth of Saint-Domingue, Napoleon's grand plan for a North American empire collapses. He suddenly has no use for the Louisiana Territory. Plus, he is gearing up to renew his massive war with Great Britain in Europe.
And to fight Britain, he needs cold, hard cash.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, back in America, Jefferson is getting incredibly nervous about France controlling the port of New Orleans. American farmers in the Ohio River Valley rely entirely on floating their crops down the Mississippi River to New Orleans to ship them to the East Coast or Europe.
It was their only lifeline.
If Napoleon shuts down access to New Orleans, the American Western economy instantly dies.
So Jefferson sends James Monroe to Paris to join the American minister, Robert Livingston. Their instructions are very clear.
They are authorized to spend up to $10 million to buy the city of New Orleans and maybe a little strip of land in West Florida. Just secure the port. That's it.
But when Monroe arrives in April 1803, the French ministers, Talleyrand and Barry-Marbois, stun the American delegation. They essentially say, "We don't want to just sell you the city. How would you like to buy the whole thing?"
The entire Louisiana Territory, 827,000 square miles of land.
They offer it for $15 million. It works out to roughly 3 cents an acre. It is the ultimate real estate bargain. It would literally double the size of the United States overnight, extending the border all the way to the Rockies.
And Monroe and Livingston, they don't have time to write back to Washington to ask for permission, right? It would take months.
They know Napoleon is volatile and might change his mind tomorrow, so they overstep their authority and sign the treaty.
They secure the land. But when the treaty reaches Jefferson and Washington, we hit that core contradiction we discussed earlier head on. This raises a massive, unavoidable constitutional crisis for Jefferson.
Because does the President of the United States actually have the legal authority to buy foreign territory?
Wait, let's be crystal clear about why this is a crisis. Remember, Jefferson's entire political brand, he is the ultimate strict constructionist. He built his entire political party fighting Alexander Hamilton, yelling at the top of his lungs, if the power is not explicitly written in the Constitution, the federal government cannot do it.
Right.
And you can read the U.S. Constitution front to back, left to right, with a magnifying glass, and you will not find a single clause that says the president has the power to purchase a continent from a French emperor.
He knows this.
Huh.
The historical letters show he suffered immense anxiety over it. He genuinely believed the purchase was an unconstitutional act. He believed that the executive branch seizing the power to absorb new lands and new peoples without the explicit consent of the states was exactly the kind of monarchical overreach he had accused Hamilton of.
So what does he do? Does he reject the treaty?
No. He actually sits down and drafts a constitutional amendment to legalize the purchase retroactively. He wants to go to the states and ask for permission.
But the amendment process takes years.
Exactly. His advisors, particularly his Secretary of State James Madison, pull him aside and say, Thomas, if we wait for an amendment, Napoleon will change his mind. The British might seize New Orleans. We will lose the continent. We have to ratify this treaty right now under the president's treaty-making powers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Jefferson is like a guy who campaigns for a decade on taking away the company credit card because it's too dangerous to trust anyone with that much financial power.
Yeah.
And then the very second he gets into the CEO's office, he swipes that same credit card to buy the biggest piece of commercial real estate in human history. He justifies it by saying, well, it's a really good deal for the shareholders.
He fundamentally prioritizes pragmatism over his own strict principles. He believed the result, securing a vast empire of liberty with enough land to sustain his yeoman farmers for 1,000 years, was essential for the survival of the Republic.
So he just ignores the Constitution.
Pretty much. Jefferson becomes curiously silent on his constitutional concerns. He takes the amendment he drafted, quietly shoves it in a desk drawer, and pushes the treaty through the Senate.
He just swallows his hypocrisy for the greater good. And ironically, the Federalists, the party of strong central government, suddenly argue that the purchase is unconstitutional.
They flip sides entirely. They complain that we're paying $15 million for a howling wilderness, that it will dilute the political power of the East Coast, and that we can't afford it.
But the American public is thrilled. The Senate ratifies the treaty, and Jefferson secures his greatest legacy. But he doesn't just buy the land. He is intensely curious about what is actually out there.
Even before the purchase was finalized, he had been planning an expedition to explore the Missouri River, establish relations with Native American tribes, and search for the holy grail of exploration, the Northwest Passage.
An all-water route to the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
This, of course, becomes the Lewis and Clark expedition, the core of discovery. And the depth of Jefferson's personal involvement in this is staggering. He doesn't just hire a random army officer or French trapper. He chooses his own personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis.
And Jefferson, who possesses the largest personal library in America on subjects like geography, botany, and natural history, essentially turns the White House into a crash course university for Lewis.
Wait, he personally tutors him.
He personally tutors Lewis. He sends him to Philadelphia to study with the greatest scientific minds in America. Lewis learns how to use celestial navigation to calculate longitude and latitude. He learns botany so he can identify new plant species. He learns mineralogy.
That's incredible. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out from St. Louis. Guided eventually by the Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, they crossed the Great Plains, survived the brutal crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains, and reached the Pacific Ocean in 1805.
They don't find a Northwest Passage because it doesn't exist, but they map the territory. They document hundreds of new plant and animal species, and they establish a firm American claim to the Pacific Northwest.
It is a massive triumph for Jefferson's vision. But the Louisiana Purchase and Western exploration aren't his only aggressive flexes of executive power during his first term. We have to shift our focus across the Atlantic. We have to talk about the pirates, the First Barbary War.
This is a fascinating evolution of his foreign policy. For decades, the Barbary states of North Africa, which included Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had been operating a massive state-sponsored piracy ring.
How did that work?
They would capture American and European merchant ships in the Mediterranean, confiscate the cargo, enslave the crews, and demand massive ransoms.
It was basically a massive protection racket on the high seas.
Yeah.
Pay us a yearly tribute, or we take your ships. And when America was a British colony, the Royal Navy protected our merchant ships. But when we won independence, we lost that naval umbrella. Our ships were suddenly sitting ducks.
And the historical record tracks Jefferson's intense frustration with this going back to the 1780s. When he was a diplomat in Paris, he met with John Adams, who was in London, to negotiate with the ambassador from Tripoli.
And what did the ambassador say?
They asked why Tripoli was attacking unprovoked. The ambassador essentially told them that it was the right and duty of their nation to plunder non-believers. Jefferson was furious. He wanted to fight. He proposed forming a coalition of European nations to blockade North Africa and bomb them into submission.
But the U.S. couldn't do that. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government was completely broke. We had no navy. Congress wouldn't fund one.
So for over a decade, the United States simply pays the bribes. During Washington and Adams's administrations, the U.S. paid upwards of $1 million in tribute and ransom. It consumed a massive percentage of the entire federal budget.
Wow. But then Jefferson becomes president, and just weeks before his inauguration in 1801, the ruler of Tripoli, the Bashaw, decides the tribute isn't high enough.
He chops down the flagpole in front of the U.S. consulate, which is the traditional declaration of war, and demands a massive increase in payments.
And here's the supreme irony of the situation. How does Jefferson respond? To fight this war, he utilizes the United States Navy, specifically the heavy, expensive frigates that the Federalists had championed and built during the 1790s.
Yes.
The very ships Jefferson and his Republican Party had fiercely opposed as dangerous tools of centralized imperial power.
The guy who just spent the election screaming about demilitarizing the government inherits the Federalist war machine and immediately deploys it.
Exactly. And he does it unilaterally. He sends a naval squadron to the Mediterranean without asking Congress for a formal declaration of war. He informs Congress after the ships have already sailed, claiming he gave them orders only to observe and defend, but the commanders understood they were authorized to engage.
It's the birth of the modern presidential war power. I'm not declaring war, I'm just using the military.
Right. And the war itself has huge dramatic swings. It doesn't go well at first. In 1803, the U.S. frigate Philadelphia chases a pirate ship too close to shore, runs aground on an uncharted reef, and is captured by Tripoli. The captain and 300 American sailors are thrown into a dungeon.
The Bashaw of Tripoli now has one of the most advanced warships in the world sitting in his harbor, ready to be refitted and used against American shipping. It's a strategic disaster.
But this disaster leads to one of the most famous swashbuckling moments in early American naval history. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, a young, brash naval officer, volunteers for a covert mission.
In February 1804, he takes a small captured ship disguised as a merchant vessel, sails it right into the heavily fortified harbor of Tripoli in the dead of night, and pulls up right next to the captured Philadelphia.
Then what?
Decatur and his men storm the ship, overpower the guards, and instead of trying to sail the massive frigate out under the guns of the fort, they plant explosives and set the ship on fire. They row away as the Philadelphia explodes, ensuring the pirates can't use it. The British Admiral Lord Nelson supposedly called it the most bold and daring act of the age.
It turns a military disaster into a massive point of national pride. Decatur becomes a national hero.
Ultimately, Jefferson uses a combination of naval bombardments and a covert land mission led by William Eaton, who marched a mercenary army across the desert to capture a Tripolitan city, to force Tripoli to the negotiating table in 1805. They sign a peace treaty that secures the release of the prisoners and ends the tribute payments to Tripoli.
So take a step back and look at the end of Jefferson's first term. He has doubled the size of the country without firing a shot. He has stabilized the economy and significantly cut the national debt. He's projected American military power overseas and stood up to pirates. He has rolled back the oppressive speech-chilling laws of his Federalist predecessors.
It is an absolutely stunning string of successes.
It is arguably one of the most successful first terms in presidential history, and it is reflected in the election of 1804. He wins re-election in an absolute landslide against the Federalist candidate Charles Cosworth Pinckney. Jefferson wins 162 electoral votes to Pinckney's 14. He wins every state in the Union except Connecticut and Delaware. The Federalist Party is essentially shattered as a national force.
But you know the old saying about hubris? The massive strokes of luck, the brilliant pragmatic compromises of his first 4 years, they abandoned him completely. His second term is, well, it's kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, it starts going off the rails.
It begins with a bizarre and dangerous domestic crisis centered on his former vice president, Aaron Burr. Burr, you recall, tied Jefferson in 1800 and tried to steal the presidency.
Right.
Jefferson never trusted him again, and Burr was officially dropped from the Republican ticket in 1804.
Burr is desperate for political survival. He tries to run for governor of New York, loses badly, and blames Alexander Hamilton for orchestrating his defeat. This toxic, decades-long rivalry culminates in July 1804, when Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, and mortally wounds him.
The Vice President of the United States shoots and kills the former Secretary of the Treasury. It is an event that is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms. Burr is indicted for murder in 2 states. He is disgraced, his political career on the East Coast is utterly destroyed, and when his term as VP ends, he flees to the West.
And out in the West, Burr gets involved in something called the Burr Conspiracy. And I know the details are murky, but what exactly was he plotting?
The exact details are still debated by historians because Burr told different stories to different people depending on what he wanted from them. But the reports that reached Jefferson and Washington suggested Burr was floating down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, assembling a private army, stocking arms, and building custom flatboats.
To do what?
The goal was allegedly to provoke a war with Spain and conquer Spanish territory in Mexico.
Which is illegal for a private citizen to do.
Very illegal. But the more sinister rumor was that Burr intended to capture New Orleans and carve out an independent empire in the western United States, effectively separating the newly acquired Louisiana territory from the Union, with himself as the emperor.
So the guy Jefferson tied with for the presidency is now allegedly plotting to rip the country in half. Jefferson is alarmed. He issues a presidential proclamation declaring Burr's actions illegal, and Burr is eventually captured in 1807. He is hauled back to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason.
And presiding over this treason trial, sitting as a circuit judge, is none other than Chief Justice John Marshall.
Oh boy.
Marshall is a staunch Federalist, a brilliant jurist, and a bitter, lifelong political enemy of his cousin, Thomas Jefferson. The trial immediately devolves into a massive constitutional clash between the executive branch and the judicial branch.
Wait, how does Jefferson get directly involved in the trial? He's not the prosecutor.
He gets involved because Burr's defense team pulls a brilliant legal maneuver. They subpoena President Jefferson.
They subpoena the president.
Yes. They demand that he appear in court and bring specific letters and documents sent to the White House regarding Burr's activities, claiming these documents are essential to prove Burr's innocence.
And Jefferson essentially says, no, I am the president of the United States. A judge cannot force me to show up in court or hand over my private correspondence.
Exactly. He asserts what we now legally call executive privilege. Jefferson argues that if the president can be summoned to court at the whim of any judge, the independence of the executive branch is destroyed. He argues his primary duty is to run the country in Washington, not sit in a witness box in Richmond. He agrees to provide some of the documents voluntarily, but he absolutely refuses to appear in person.
Again, we see the champion of limited government flexing enormous executive muscle to protect the presidency.
Right. In the end, John Marshall rules that to be convicted of treason under the strict definition in the Constitution, there must be an overt act of levying war, witnessed by 2 people. Gathering an army and talking about treason isn't enough. You actually have to commit the violent act. The government's case falls apart, and Burr is acquitted.
Jefferson is furious. He believes Marshall twisted the law to protect a traitor just to embarrass the administration. But honestly, the Burr trial is just a domestic headache compared to the absolute catastrophe that is unfolding simultaneously in foreign policy.
Oh, yeah.
We have to return to the global stage. Britain and France are locked in the Napoleonic Wars.
Sure.
It is a brutal, total existential war for control of Europe. And both superpowers are trying to starve each other by blockading trade. The United States, as a neutral shipping nation, is trying to thread the needle and trade with both sides to make money.
But neutrality is impossible when both superpowers view trading with their enemy as an act of war. The French sees American ships trading with Britain, and the British sees American ships trading with France. But the British are doing something much more provocative, something that deeply inflames American honor. It's a practice called impressment.
Explain the mechanics of impressment, because it sounds like literal kidnapping.
That's essentially what it was. The British Royal Navy was massive, and the conditions on board were so horrific that sailors constantly deserted, often finding better pay and safer conditions on American merchant vessels. The British response was to stop American ships on the open ocean, send heavily armed boarding parties onto the decks, line up the crew, and forcefully remove anyone they claimed was a British deserter, pressing them back into service in the Royal Navy.
But they weren't just taking British citizens, were they?
Not at all. The British burden of proof was incredibly low, and they routinely kidnapped native-born American citizens. It is estimated they impressed roughly 6,000 American seamen. It was an egregious violation of American sovereignty.
And this boils over in 1807 with the Chesapeake Leopard affair. This wasn't just stopping a merchant ship. The British warship HMS Leopard approaches a United States Navy vessel, the USS Chesapeake, just a few miles off the coast of Virginia. The British demand to search the American warship for deserters. The American captain refuses.
So the British warship opens fire. They blast the Chesapeake at point-blank range, killing 3 American sailors and wounding 18. They board the ship and drag off 4 men.
The American public is completely outraged. There are riots, people are screaming for a declaration of war against Great Britain. But Jefferson hesitates. He remembers how close the nation came to utter destruction during the Revolution. Thanks to his own budget cuts, he has a tiny standing army and a fleet of coastal gunboats that would be annihilated by the Royal Navy in a week. War with the greatest military power on Earth is a terrible idea.
Right. So he decides to try something incredibly experimental. He tries economic coercion.
In late 1807, Jefferson pushes the Embargo Act through Congress. The theory behind it is rooted in his Enlightenment belief in rational action. He believes that Britain and France are so deeply dependent on American raw materials, timber, cotton, grain, and food, that if the United States simply stops trading with them, the resulting economic pain will force them to respect American neutrality and stop attacking ships.
So the Embargo Act essentially bans all American vessels from sailing to foreign ports and bans all foreign ships from taking American goods. He just shuts down global trade overnight.
Imagine a president today doing that. I want to use an analogy here. It's like a guy getting a bloody nose in a fight, and to stop the bleeding, he decides to tie a tourniquet tightly around his own neck.
Wow.
He intends to inflict temporary pain on the enemy, but he ends up violently strangling his own country.
That is a perfect, if gruesome, analogy. The Embargo Act is an unmitigated disaster. It doesn't starve Europe into submission, it starves America. The historical economic data from that year is staggering. U.S. exports crash from $108 million in 1807 to just $22 million in 1808.
The economy just falls off a cliff.
Completely. And the pain is highly localized. In New England, where shipping, shipbuilding, and maritime commerce were the absolute lifeblood of the economy, the region goes into a severe depression. Ships are left to rot at the docks in Boston and Salem. Tens of thousands of sailors, dock workers, and merchants are suddenly unemployed and facing ruin.
And people don't just sit in their empty warehouses and accept this. They start fighting back the only way they can, mass smuggling.
Exactly. Especially in New England, which is a Federalist stronghold anyway and already despises Jefferson. Merchants start sneaking ships out of harbors in the dead of night. They start loading wagons with goods and driving them across the border into British Canada, particularly up near Lake Champlain.
And this smuggling triggers the most profound hypocrisy of Jefferson's entire presidency. To enforce this deeply unpopular law against his own citizens, Jefferson has to resort to extreme authoritarian measures.
He asks Congress for and receives expanded enforcement powers. He uses the U.S. military and the Navy to patrol American ports. He authorizes customs officials to search ships and warehouses without warrants and to confiscate property on mere suspicion of intent to smuggle.
Hold on. Think about this. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, explicitly listing as a grievance against King George that he sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people, is now sending federal troops to harass American merchants in New England. It is a massive, flagrant violation of his own philosophy of limited government and civil liberties. He's become the tyrant he warned everyone about.
The historian Joseph Ellis calls the embargo an unadulterated calamity. It completely alienated his political base in the North. It required police-state tactics to enforce. It failed entirely to change British or French policy, and it ultimately just delayed the inevitable, laying the groundwork for the War of 1812.
How does a man, this brilliant, a guy who reads Greek philosophy for fun and maps continents, get so utterly blinded by a theory that he couldn't see the practical disaster unfolding right in front of him?
It speaks perfectly to that mountaintop mentality we discussed at Monticello. Jefferson believed his rational theory of economic coercion should work. It made perfect, logical sense in his head, and when it didn't work in reality, he didn't blame the theory. He blamed the people. He believed the failure was due to the selfish merchants of New England lacking Republican virtue. He couldn't accept that the practical reality of a sailor needing to feed his family trumped his grand philosophical design.
It is the great tragedy of his second term. He leaves office in 1809, deeply unpopular, exhausted, and feeling like a failure. But while Jefferson struggled and ultimately failed to manage the global economy and international relations, there was a much darker systemic crisis festering at the very heart of his life, his presidency, and his legacy. And this brings us to the heaviest part of our deep dive. We have to talk about slavery.
This is the issue that defines his contradictions most starkly, and the one that history has had the hardest time reconciling. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the immortal words, "All men are created equal," personally enslaved over 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime.
And we cannot examine Jefferson's relationship with slavery without examining the story of Sally Hemings. For 2 centuries, the descendants of Sally Hemings maintained a strong oral history that Thomas Jefferson was the father of her children. And for 2 centuries, many prominent white historians vehemently dismissed it. They claimed it was just a nasty political rumor started by a vindictive journalist named James Callender during Jefferson's presidency.
The historical establishment often argued it was out of character for Jefferson, completely ignoring the deeply systemic nature of sexual violence and coercion inherent in the institution of chattel slavery. But the historical landscape fundamentally, permanently shifted in 1998.
Right. The scientific journal Nature published the result of a groundbreaking DNA study.
Right.
Walk us through exactly how that study worked, because it wasn't just a simple blood test.
The researchers couldn't test Jefferson directly because he had no legitimate male heirs that survived to adulthood, so there was no direct, unbroken paternal line to test his specific Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is crucial because it passes from father to son virtually unchanged. So scientists found male descendants of Jefferson's paternal uncle, Field Jefferson. This gave them the Jefferson family Y chromosome haplotype.
Okay, they have the Jefferson baseline.
Then they tested male descendants of Sally Hemings' youngest son, Eston Hemings. When they compared the DNA, it was a perfect match. The Eston Hemings descendant carried the rare Jefferson family Y chromosome.
Now, critics initially tried to say, well, that just means a Jefferson fathered the child. It could have been his brother Randolph or his nephews.
And that is where the historical documentation comes in to close the loop. Historians like Annette Gordon-Reed, who is featured heavily in the PBS Frontline Roundtable discussions we are using as a source, cross-referenced the DNA with Jefferson's meticulous plantation records and travel logs.
And what did they find?
They found that for every single one of Sally Hemings' children, Thomas Jefferson was physically present at Monticello exactly 9 months before their birth. When he was away in Washington or Paris, she did not conceive. The DNA evidence, combined with the overwhelming circumstantial and historical timeline, created a definitive consensus.
History had to actively adjust its lens. It was no longer a rumor, it was a historical fact. Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings. She was an enslaved woman, she was 30 years younger than him, and crucially, she was the enslaved half-sister of his late wife, Martha.
Sally Hemings actually accompanied Jefferson to Paris when he was a diplomat. Slavery was illegal in France, and she could have legally claimed her freedom there. The oral history from her son, Madison Hemings, states that she negotiated with Jefferson. She agreed to return to Virginia with him back into slavery, only on the condition that any children she had with him would be freed when they reached the age of 21.
And he apparently kept that promise. Of the 6 children they had together, 4 survived to adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Jefferson eventually allowed Beverly and Harriet to escape without pursuit, and he formally freed Madison and Eston in his will. They were the only enslaved family unit he ever freed. He never formally freed Sally herself. She was allowed to live in unofficial freedom in Charlottesville by his daughter Martha after his death.
We have to place this intensely private reality alongside his public political actions regarding slavery. During his presidency, Jefferson achieved what he viewed as a major milestone. In his 1806 message to Congress, he called upon them to criminalize the international slave trade.
The Constitution had a compromise clause that prevented Congress from banning the importation of slaves from Africa for 20 years until 1808.
Yes. So, as soon as that 20-year window opens, Jefferson eagerly signs the law banning the transatlantic slave trade, effective January 1st, 1808. He publicly condemns the trade as a violation of human rights. And on the surface, if you just read the plaque, that sounds like a massive progressive leap forward.
But when you look at the mechanics of the economy, it has a horrific dark side.
A deeply dark domestic consequence. By legally stopping the importation of new enslaved people from Africa, the law vastly restricted the supply of enslaved labor just as the demand was skyrocketing. The invention of the cotton gin was making cotton cultivation insanely profitable in the Deep South and the newly acquired Louisiana Territory.
So if you can't buy enslaved people from Africa, where do you get them?
You buy them from the Upper South. The ban on the international trade instantly drove up the financial value of the enslaved people already living in the United States. It created a booming, horrific domestic slave trade. Enslavers in Virginia and Maryland, where the tobacco soil was depleted and they had an excess of enslaved labor, suddenly found a highly lucrative market selling human beings down the river to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South.
Jefferson's law, intended to strike a blow against the institution, ended up deeply enriching Virginia enslavers and tearing apart countless enslaved families in the domestic trade. And his foreign policy also heavily reflected the deep paranoia of Southern slaveholders.
We mentioned earlier that the successful slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution, directly forced Napoleon to sell the Louisiana Territory. Haiti essentially handed Jefferson his greatest presidential triumph.
But how does Jefferson treat the new nation of Haiti?
When Haiti declares its independence in 1804, becoming the first free black republic in the world, Jefferson absolutely refuses to recognize them diplomatically. In 1806, he even supports a congressional embargo cutting off trade with Haiti.
Why? Why turn his back on a nation that just fought a revolution for the exact same liberty he wrote about in 1776?
Because the Southern planter class was terrified. They looked across the water at Haiti and saw their absolute worst nightmare: a successful, violent slave uprising that wiped out the white enslavers. Jefferson acquiesced to that fear. He prioritized the economic stability and the physical security of the Southern slave economy over the democratic principles he claimed to champion.
So how do we process this? I really want you, listening to this right now, to try to hold these two truths in your head at the exact same time. You have the absolute genius of the Declaration of Independence, a document that has inspired genuine freedom and civil rights movements across the globe for centuries. And you have the reality of a man who enslaved his own children, who routinely bought and sold human beings to fund his fine wine collection and his endless architectural hobbies. It's like discovering that the brilliant architect who designed a beautiful, structurally sound, life-saving hospital is also the person secretly poisoning the city's water supply. How do you reconcile that?
The painful truth is that Jefferson herself struggled with it, though rarely in public. He intellectually recognized the deep moral evil of slavery. He knew it directly contradicted the foundational ideals of the Revolution. In his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote about slavery. "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever."
He knew a reckoning was coming.
He absolutely knew it. He wrote a famous letter regarding the Missouri Compromise in 1820, where he described the institution of slavery with a chilling, perfect metaphor. He wrote, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other."
The wolf by the ears. It's such a vivid image. If you hold on to the ears, you are locked in a constant, terrifying struggle. But if you let go, the wolf turns and destroys you.
By saying that, he is openly admitting that slavery is fundamentally unjust. But he is deliberately, consciously prioritizing the self-preservation of the white societal structure and his own personal financial comfort over fundamental human rights. He simply could not envision a multiracial society where free black people and white people lived together peacefully. He genuinely thought emancipation would inevitably lead to a race war.
So his solution was essentially do nothing.
It is the great moral failure of his life. He recognized the disease, he diagnosed it accurately, but he completely refused to administer the cure because the cure would require dismantling his entire way of life. He abdicated the responsibility and left the problem for future generations to solve, which they eventually did, but only through the unimaginable bloodshed of the American Civil War.
His inability to solve this crisis haunts his legacy. It is the deep crack in the foundation of Monticello. But as his presidency ended in 1809, and he returned to that mountaintop for good, he largely turned away from the intractable, messy political problems of the nation. He turned his focus back to what he always believed was his truest, most pure domain, the freedom of the human mind.
Throughout his entire life, despite all his political maneuvering, Jefferson maintained a deep, almost fierce commitment to the concept of religious freedom. He was fundamentally a deist. He believed in a creator who designed a rational, mathematically perfect universe, but he rejected orthodox Christian doctrines. He didn't believe in miracles, the virgin birth, or the resurrection. He valued human reason over divine revelation.
And he didn't just hold those beliefs privately, he worked tirelessly to codify them into law. Years before the U.S. Constitution was even written, he drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom.
This was a revolutionary document in 1777. At the time, Virginia had an official, state-sponsored church. The Anglican Church and citizens were forced to pay taxes to support it, regardless of their own beliefs. Jefferson's statute completely disestablished the state church and guaranteed that no citizen could be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship. It established absolute freedom of conscience.
And during his presidency, he articulated this philosophy in a way that still actively governs our legal interpretation of the First Amendment today. In 1802, the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut wrote a letter to President Jefferson. They were a minority religious sect, and they were complaining that their religious freedom was not being protected by the Federalist-controlled state government, which still favored the Congregationalist Church.
Jefferson writes back to them, and in his reply, he uses a phrase that has become the bedrock of American jurisprudence regarding religion. He writes that the First Amendment of the Constitution built a wall of separation between church and state.
A wall of separation.
It is a profound architectural concept. He believed religion was entirely a private, intimate matter between a person and their God, and the government had absolutely zero business interfering in that relationship or favoring one sect over another.
And his own personal relationship with religion was fascinatingly complex. Have you ever looked into the mechanics of the Jefferson Bible?
The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, which he compiled during his retirement around 1820.
The way he compiled it is the crazy part. He didn't just write a commentary. He literally sat in his study at Monticello with a sharp razor blade and copies of the New Testament in Greek, Latin, French, and English. And he physically cut out the passages he didn't believe in. He cut out the angels, the water turning to wine, the resurrection, anything supernatural. He pasted together only the moral teachings of Jesus, whom he considered to be one of the greatest moral philosophers in human history, but absolutely not a divine being.
It is the ultimate expression of the Enlightenment mind. He applies pure reason and a literal razor blade to sacred religious text. He extracts what he believes is rational and useful and discards the rest.
In his long post-presidency, he also does some profound personal repairing. He and John Adams, who had been such bitter, vicious enemies during the election of 1800 that they didn't speak for a decade, finally reconcile. Mutual friends encourage them to write to each other, and they begin this incredible, voluminous correspondence that lasts for the rest of their lives.
It's a beautiful exchange. You have two old revolutionaries, the primary architects of the nation, sitting in their respective homes in Massachusetts and Virginia, debating philosophy, reflecting on the nation they built, and wondering if the experiment will survive them.
And his final great project is both architectural and intellectual. He designs and founds the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And importantly, it is centered not around a church or a chapel, as almost all universities were at the time, but around a massive library, the Rotunda.
It was a deliberately secular academical village dedicated to the free exchange of ideas and the pursuit of truth.
He designs the physical curriculum, he hires the professors from Europe, he designs the pavilions, he literally sits on his mountaintop at Monticello with a telescope, watching the bricklayers construct the university down in the valley below. And then we reach the end, July 4th, 1826.
The timing is almost too poetic, too perfectly scripted to be real. Thomas Jefferson dies in his bed at Monticello on the exact 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence.
And just hours later, hundreds of miles away in Braintree, Massachusetts, John Adams passes away as well. Adams' final words were reported to be, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know his old friend and rival had beaten him to the grave by just a few hours.
It was viewed by the nation as almost a sign of divine providence. But when you look at Jefferson's grave at Monticello today, the epitaph carved into the stone is incredibly revealing. Jefferson left explicit, handwritten instructions on exactly what he wanted carved on his tombstone and nothing else.
It reads, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia."
Notice what is missing from that list.
The presidency. He served 2 full terms as the President of the United States. He was the nation's first Secretary of State, the Vice President, the Governor of Virginia. He literally doubled the physical size of the country. And he leaves every single political office off his tombstone. Why? Why would a man who held the highest office in the land omit it completely from his final public statement to history?
Because to Jefferson, those offices were temporary. They were matters of administration, of painful political compromise, of mud wrestling with people like Hamilton and Marshall. He recognized that his political actions, like the Catastrophic Embargo Act, or his hypocritical silence on slavery, were deeply flawed, messy, and temporal. But ideas, the assertion of fundamental human equality, the legal guarantee of religious freedom, the expansion of human knowledge through education, those are eternal. He wanted to be remembered not for the raw power he wielded, but for the freedom of the mind that he championed.
Political power was a dirty necessity to him, but the architecture of ideas was his true legacy. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We've traced the life of a man who expanded a nation through sheer pragmatic willpower during the Louisiana Purchase, who stumbled drastically and hypocritically when his theories failed him during the embargo, and who lived a life of staggering moral contradiction regarding human bondage.
We've seen how his meticulous architectural mind tried to impose rational order on a chaotic world, often shielding himself from the brutal, unseen realities that sustained his mountaintop vision.
And that leads to a final thought we want to leave you with today. We've talked so much about his obsession with architecture, with building and constantly renovating Monticello. What if we look at the entire American project as his ultimate Monticello?
If we consider the United States as his grandest architectural blueprint, we have to realize it was deliberately left unfinished. He left us the magnificent, soaring superstructure, the beautiful words of the Declaration, the ideals of equality and liberty. But he also left the brutal, hypocritical reality of systemic inequality deeply embedded in the foundation.
The provocation for you to mull over is this. Is the task of every subsequent generation of Americans not just to stand back and admire Jefferson's beautiful blueprint? Is our job instead to actively tear down and rebuild the compromised, broken foundations he left behind until the house actually matches the ideals he wrote on the paper?
It's a question that requires us to look at history not as a finished monument carved in stone, but as an ongoing construction project.
And that is a wrap on our deep dive into the historical record today. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive exploration of Thomas Jefferson. Keep questioning the plaque, keep looking at the foundations, and keep exploring history. We'll see you next time.